Folks, welcome back to Talkin Soccer. I am your host, Justin Horniker. On today's episode, we are going to go over the MLS Cup final that took place at Dignity Health Sports Park in Carson, California on Saturday, before touching on the State of the League address by Don Garber Friday night. Some interesting tidbits from that State of the League address that I want to talk about, and kind of talk about some positive takeaways as well as some of the skepticism around it as well. And then, if we have time, we'll touch on we have the MLS Cup is over. The Galaxy have been awarded the championship. And now on Tuesday, teams have to have their expansion protection lists submitted to the league. So it moves quickly from here on out. We have the expansion draft, the MLS Super Draft, and then the transfer window opening in 3 weeks' time now. The sun never sleeps on American soccer, I think is how the phrase goes, right? That's how that phrase was originated. So moving on to the MLS Cup, LA Galaxy against New York Red Bull. And I want to talk about the Galaxy first, then we'll kind of get into the Red Bulls and as a 7 seed, making to the final, what this loss means for them and their future. But for the Galaxy to come into this match, they lost Ricky Puig in the semifinal. He tears his ACL. He's probably going to miss a lot of 2025, which is something we'll talk about when we talk about their roster going forward. But he tears his ACL. He picks up the game-winning assist against Seattle and really kind of lit a fire under the Galaxy's desire to win this game for Ricky. Joseph Paintsel scores the first goal in the 9th minute. They don't get the Ricky Puig jersey over to him quick enough. He wants it. He's gesturing for it. He talked about it after the match how he was a little bit mad in the moment that they didn't have the kit ready for him. But Dejan Joveljic, 4 minutes later, turns in a fantastic goal, just kind of playing him through the center. He turns. He's in on goal. It's a nice, clean finish. And the Galaxy are up 2-1 through 13 minutes. And without Ricky Puig, what Will Kuntz has been able to do to build a team of young, either, coming into their prime or prime athletes coming from Joseph Paintsel, coming from Genk, for instance. These players that have come to MLS, some to prove a point, some because they were just looking for a fresh opportunity in a league that still captures eyes from the Europe top leagues. MLS is becoming that league. And I think when you have a team like the Galaxy, Ricky Puig stating after the match that he's going to stay in LA forever. We'll see if that's true or not. But, it's starting to become a point where these really talented players can come to MLS. And it's not necessarily about being a jumping off point to Europe, but more or less it just gives players an opportunity to come be in the American sports system and have a life. Have a life in Los Angeles. You can't really be mad about that. And it's just becoming an option, really, is what I'm trying to say. And for Joseph Paintsel, for Dejan Jokovic, for Gabriel Peck, that big three of the Galaxy, what Will Kuntz has been able to build around. And even in this game where you don't have Ricky Puig, you have a Gaston Brugman who is able to kind of fill that role in terms of his distribution. You have fullbacks who are defensively liable, but have a great ability to just play players into the attack, to focus on former St. Louis City player John Nelson for a moment. John Nelson has been their starting left back all year, and he was a player that did not have a job in St. Louis come, the halfway point of the season. I think it just speaks to Will Kuntz's ability to find players in those margins that aren't necessarily setting the world on fire, but in John Nelson's case, can come in to the lineup and spring passes. And that's kind of all you're asking for him. He's not defensively sound. He isn't the best under pressure, but I think you saw in a couple points in this game that he's able to just spring Joseph Paintsel down that left flank and create danger for a Red Bull squad that had a lot of inability to keep up with Paintsel down that left side, especially. And it all starts, I wrote about it on the Substack earlier this week heading into the final, but that this all kind of started from that fan revolt that they had just LA Galaxy fans, the Riot Squad kind of leading the way, although it was pretty much a joint effort. were so angry about the direction of the club, about what Chris Klein had done in building a roster centered around your Chicharritos, your Zlatan Ibrahimovic's, which were, especially in Zlatan's case, incredible players, but that is kind of where the roster build started and stopped. And then you saw that last year, of course, they have the transfer ban and things kind of roll downhill from there. But Ricky Puig went from having no one to pass to having Pek, Paintsel, and Djokovic in front of him, and just what that allowed them to do, go from 13th place last year to second place, almost winning the Western Conference, if not for their inability to defend, and to have a bright future after this. Now, what that looks like in the absence of Ricky Puig next year, outside of this one-off, is maybe a different story, but something that I think the Galaxy will like, something that Greg Vanney will like, and something that Greg Vanney talked about after the match is that this, especially in not starting Marco Reus, which maybe points to Marco Reus being a little more banged up than they had let on. He had to leave at halftime of the game last weekend against Seattle. Only plays 20 minutes in this match, but they honestly didn't really need him with those two early goals. And it's a little more grittiness in the midfield, especially against a team like the Red Bull that are going to try to win those battles, those second balls. And the Galaxy won more of the second balls. They won more of the duels. And it put the Red Bull under pressure, especially when they think the big story of this game is that Noah Ali has to come in on like 5-10 minutes notice. Apple TV said 5 to 10 minutes notice. Andres Reyes was sick ahead of the game, couldn't play. They had to make that sub with minimal time. He's kind of like trying to warm up during the pomp and circumstance during the National Cup final pregame, and is kind of exposed early on. I don't know if this is all to blame on his defending or if it's just keeping everyone organized with the center back that didn't know he was playing 5 minutes before. But Paintsel burns him on the first goal. Jovic burns him with the spacing, giving him too much space on the second goal. And then within 14 minutes, the Galaxy are up 2-0, and you're thinking, okay, this match is going to get out of control. But credit to Sandra Schwartz, the Red Bulls were able to keep things tight and eventually exploit the Galaxy's just inability to clear out set piece balls. They grab a goal to slash the lead in half. Sean Nealis, essentially on a corner that the Galaxy had 3 separate attempts to clear the ball out. It hits the ground twice in the box, and Nealis is eventually able to just put it past John McCarthy. But, it's an Achilles heel for a team that, I don't want to say that the Red Bulls were lucky. They obviously deserved to be here, but with the way that things panned out, the talent advantage was definitely in LA's favor, especially through that first half. They were able to keep Emil Forsberg off the ball. Now, with the final 20 minutes, Forsberg really built into the game, or that second half as well, to the point where he had a big opportunity to tie the game heading into stoppage time. But the Galaxy end up winning, and it's a 6th MLS Cup. It's a historic 6th MLS Cup, the first of the 6. And the fact that it took them 10 years from 2014 to now to get back to that point, it shows why that boycott last season was so important. Chris Klein is ousted. They bring in Heinz, but he's not GM right away. They have a restructuring of the front office, and eventually it leads to what we have, the organization they have now, and then they have the winter window and the summer transfer window to essentially build this roster. And for the most part, Wilkins built this roster in the last winter window, which is maybe even more impressive with how difficult it sometimes is for MLS clubs, at least to hear MLS GMs and sporting directors talk about it in that winter window. But surrounding a player like Ricky Puig with just attacking weapons is a pretty good plan, and it worked out perfectly for Wilkins in the LA Galaxy. Greg Vanney, of course, you have to talk about him sticking through the ups and downs from 2021 to now, and in his post-match, he said that, this was the goal. This is why I came back to the club that is home to me. And I think there's a lot of that talk with these players. Seeing the Galaxy fall out of relevancy, seeing LAFC come in and kind of take that shine from them with, they're the shining darlings of MLS for so long with Dignity Health Sports Park, with Beckham, with Robbie Keane, with Landon Donovan's prime career, essentially. And they were the prestige team of MLS until MLS 3.0, 4.0, whatever we want to call it now. You have new markets coming in. Each new market pushes the league forward in some direction. And now these MLS original clubs are looking up and saying, oh, we've gotten passed by all these new clubs that come in with their new approaches, with their ability to change things up, with their ability to be flexible. And I think it's credit to the Galaxy to finally, after the fan backlash, after it was apparent that their lack of commitment to a style, their lack of commitment to a way forward to a cup, not just bringing in stars to be able to market behind, was costing them match day revenue, was costing them a match day environment with the supporter boycott. And I think it just goes to show that supporters have a more important voice than they realize. And, it's important to keep ownership. It's important to keep clubs in general on their toes and able to know that their actions are inactions are directly contributable to what the product on the pitch is. And for fans to be able to have a say in that, I think it should be a lesson for a lot of fan base in the league to learn. But that turns into the Galaxy taking things seriously, Will Kuntz coming in and putting his plan into place after their summer transfer ban. And then they win MLS Cup during a year where it wasn't necessarily thought that the Galaxy would win, but they come in, especially with Inter Miami's defensive lapses being taken advantage of in the East, that the Galaxy were able to just run through Minnesota. They're able to find the win over Seattle. And I don't know, especially in a West where typically it is a little bit of a tougher grind through the Western Conference. There's teams that have been around for a long time. They're savvy. With the Sounders, for instance, you have a team that almost feels inevitable even when you count them out. The Galaxy are now, starting to inch into that territory. They have to recreate it next year. And with Ricky Puig's injury most likely keeping him out for most of next season, it becomes difficult. So you can't really replace him like for like with him being back at some point during the season. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Galaxy navigate this, but they have their 6th title. They did it for Ricky. Looking at the celebrations, it will not matter how next year goes if they can make the playoffs. And then, from there, it's anyone's game. And it's not to say it's easy to make the playoffs in MLS, but if they can put together a functional midfield around this attacking talent, if they can keep this attacking talent together, would be the other thing, especially with players like Joveljic and Gabriel Peck, who are going to be getting looks whether they go or not, or whether they receive what they think is the value for them, will be interesting to pay attention to. For the Red Bulls now, this is a game that they will, not to say want to forget, but a game where they could have had so much more. As I said, you already have that center back issue to start with Andres Reyes not being able to play. That talent gap was still huge, even without Ricky Puig for LA. And the Red Bulls, their advantage is the way that they play, the way that they can trap you in certain situations, the way that they can put you under pressure. But, they need their star to show up. And I think that's where you see them as a 7th seed. They aren't a 7th seed if Emil Forsberg isn't healthy all year. And they aren't a 7th seed if Emil Forsberg is healthy all year. So because of that Emil Forsberg injury through a lot of the summer, you're left with a team that maybe expectations are lower than what they should be for the amount of talent on this team, especially with how Lewis Morgan has been playing all year long as the comeback player of the year, or a good candidate for the comeback player of the year. And then you have a lot of homegrowns just kind of surrounded within. So you have these players that are fully committed to the Red Bull style. You have players that have grown up in that Red Bull style, that especially like Emil Forsberg knows that Red Bull style, right? Even though he hasn't been a New York Red Bull for a long time, he comes from Leipzig and has played in that style, his whole prime of his career. So I don't want to say it's tough for the Red Bull to get back here, but they have more work to do from a talent level, from a just figuring out, like, where do they go to improve? Definitely in that midfield. Going into this game with like Peter Stroud as a starting midfielder, I think is something that if they have their ideal lineup, if they are able to continue spending going into this offseason, that isn't necessarily, I think that's definitely a place that they can find value in next year. There's a lot to do here, but the fact they were able to make the final a year where they were wondering if they're even going to keep their playoff streak alive. They lose the final game of the season and are able to kind of use that to formulate a plan against Columbus. As they formulate that plan, they find a 3-4-2-1, 3-4-3, whatever you want to call it, that works very well. And then they ride that through the rest of the playoffs to the point where they found success on set pieces. Set piece FC struck again to close that 2-0 lead to 2-1. And then a second half where their Red Bulls had their chances. But at the end of the day, the underlying stats point to a game that should have ended 2-1 to the Galaxy. The Galaxy win 2-1. Everyone's missing stars. It's been a long season. And now we can turn the page with the LA Galaxy as your 2024 MLS Cup champions. And it paints an interesting narrative in LA too. The Galaxy will think of this as them getting back to the promised land, getting back to the mountaintop. But LAFC won the US Open Cup as well. And so they're sharing that domestic silverware in a market where both these clubs want to be that team for LA. There's a lot of Los Angeles-ness in this win, a lot of Kendrick Lamar references in this win. And I think that LAFC will be very motivated next year. So it not only drives the Galaxy with the Ricky Puig injury to find a way to get better in the offseason, and I think they can certainly upgrade at fullback and center back if they wanted to go that route, and goalkeeper if they wanted to go that route. But there are areas to improve. There are areas to wonder, will they be able to hold on to these players? There's a lot of interesting things with the Galaxy if they are to attempt to repeat next year, as tough as that will be. Which leads us into Don Garber's 2024 State of the League address. And I thought there were a lot of interesting takeaways from Don Garber's talk on Friday. A lot of insights into the Apple TV deal, the MLS Season Pass deal. We don't always get a lot of numbers because there's no Nielsen rating to track with Apple TV, but Don Garber stated and was adamant that this is a partnership. It's not necessarily broadcast rights deal. It's that MLS is a partner with Apple. I talked about the integrations and Apple products, all that marketing speak and stuff. But a couple of things that I thought were interesting. Garber stated that they wanted to make those Saturday night 7 p.m. start times appointment viewing. Garber said that the league has patience, even if the media and the fans don't necessarily have patience. But the full quote, we have over 1 million viewers watching those games on a Saturday night. That's more than we have had previously. We're very much leaned into destination viewership. We're patient. I'm not sure how much the media is, but we're patient. So that partnership was front and center through all this. They'll have a docuseries, an all-access docuseries that I think starts premiering either in December or January. And one of the big episodes is going to be following around Ricky Puig and the Galaxy, and it looks very good from what they've shown so far, and I'm excited about that. And I think that's one aspect of this Apple partnership that we haven't necessarily seen yet, or all the other things that they're doing. Obviously, they cut down on some of the studio stuff this year, but it sounds like from this talk that both sides are pretty happy with how things are going. Some other big insights. MLS attendance-wise is the second most attended league in the world. That's, of course, on overall attendance. When you break it down by per game, by per capacity, it's a little bit different. But I think MLS, for where they've been, It's very important. So obviously MLS has around 100 more matches than Europe's top leagues, but they only trail the Premier League in terms of like overall attendance. It's a sport that's been fighting relevance for like a century at this point. It's starting to get to the point where certain metrics it's beating out in the traditional top four American sports. And MLS average attendance has finally passed up NBA and NHL numbers. And globally, it fits in between the Brasileiro and League One in terms of average attendance per game. So more than Brazil, just a hair under where France is on a per game basis. They only trail the Premier League, NFL, Bundesliga, and NHL in terms of percent of capacity throughout the season, which I think is a interesting stat. Of course, some of those numbers are the messy games where they're playing in larger stadiums. So those capacity numbers are skewed a little bit, but I think it speaks to that MLS have kind of nailed with these stadiums that they built, these purpose-built stadiums, not just getting the vibe right, but getting the capacity right. And, sometimes you maybe take a sellout over that extra capacity, and then, of course, they make up for it by charging more. But I think, the game day experience of Major League Soccer is one of its selling points for sure. The TV stuff still has to catch up. It's still not where it needs to be for MLS to be like seen as a important league in this country. You still have traditional media forgetting soccer exists, forgetting that MLS exists. And I think in some places, NWSL has a larger marketability than MLS does, but MLS is getting there. And I think with its growth through just the traditional soccer market as well, it's definitely a top 10 league in the world now in a lot of metrics and most metrics. I think that's a comfortable place to be. If it will ever break into that top 5, it's going to take time. It's going to take more commitment in terms of spending. It's going to take maybe relaxing some of the rules, maybe organizing some of the rules so they're not quite as confusing. I don't even know if it's necessarily relaxing, but maybe it's more of making sure that your DP and your young DP and your U22 initiative wording is much easier to understand for your average fan. I think that's one thing that MLS could do much better, is making things more easily digestible for your average fan. That being said, like NBA salary cap is hard to figure out as well, like for someone just like barely paying attention. So it's not necessarily that the salary cap rules are tough, because every league outside of Major League Baseball has these salary cap rules. Hockey is a little more straightforward, but NBA, NFL have confusing rules as well. So it's not even just MLS that has these confusing roster rules, as much as MLS is kind of like Frankenstein together from 3 different eras in an era when the league almost went bankrupt 20 years ago. So going from that point to where, 20 years ago, it was unsure if the league would exist. Here we are today, pushing into the top 10 leagues globally with a very fiscally responsible outlook. Sometimes they should be a little bit more fiscally irresponsible, but that's just me talking as someone who doesn't have to put money into it. I thought that part was interesting just to hear those numbers, because we don't see a lot of that. Of course, the number 12.1 million fans across the season. I think that's great. It's obviously huge. MLS is growing. Some of that's on the back of Messi, of course, but I think some of that isn't replicable, because Messi is just such a phenomena, such a force. But you might, so after Messi retires, or even in the next couple of years when the shine wears off, you're going to see some drops. But with what teams have been able to do in terms of building their own stars, I think that's one of the successes of the Galaxy this year. You look at Paintsel, you look at Ricky Puig, you look at Peck, you look at Jovic, like these are star players, but they weren't necessarily stars coming into the league. Like Ricky Puig was unsure who he was after his time at Barcelona. And like, of course you knew he was a good player, but you didn't know he was this player. And he was definitely not a star. And the league has built those stars. They've created stars. You look at like Denny Belonga in LAFC to keep that LA train going. And it, paints to this ability that if MLS can keep doing this, if they can keep these Apple partnerships going where they're showcasing these stars that they're building and not relying on players from other leagues to come in and bring that star power, that's the way forward for them. If they can keep on that trajectory, if they don't get spooked by falling revenues after Messi leaves, that's the important thing to look for. And that's kind of where I see the most optimism as well. I look at clubs that are doing things, going about things in their own way that aren't falling back on bringing in aging stars. And I think that part of it you also see with New York, or Red Bulls, New York, New Jersey Metro Stars, where it wasn't just Emil Forsberg, but it's also 6 homegrown players that were from the New York, New Jersey area in this lineup that saw the pitch in MLS Cup final. That's important too. Those homegrown stars, that ability to not just bring in players from abroad, but also build up stars here locally. From a St. Louis aspect, I think that's the part that I look forward to the most. Obviously, St. Louis is a club that isn't going to be spending big on aging Euro stars. Outside of Roman Berkey. I think Roman Berkey does fit that mold. Maybe that's the Dortmund fan in me speaking. But it's those young players that are going to break through the lineup that can potentially have a life in MLS before they leave to Europe, or just, be MLS lifers that I think are the most important to the health of any local market. Some other things from this talk: a lot of Leagues Cup, a lot of US Open Cup talk. Ernst Tanner from Philadelphia talked 2 weeks ago now about how Philly wasn't going to be in the Leagues Cup, and that kind of blew the doors off of some things that weren't announced yet. But Don Garber spoke to some of that in his talk, and essentially they're rethinking the Leagues Cup, not just because of the schedule congestion. Schedule congestion is an issue, especially with the Club World Cup next year, with the World Cup in 2026. MLS is taking the World Cup off in 2026. They're taking part of 2025 off as well. So maybe that's where the Leagues Cup fits in those times. But essentially, clubs, it sounds like, will have a decision whether they want to play in the US Open Cup or the Leagues Cup. Garber mentioned the need for more Liga MX MLS matchups. That was one of the failings of this format currently, is that I always point to that match in St. Louis. St. Louis hosted Portland for the round of 32 game, and they had 10,000 plus fans, which was less than what St. Louis City 2 had for their MLS Next Pro season finale against Tacoma. Obviously, there are caveats there, being the price of the Leagues Cup games, the price of MLS Next Pro games. But your competition that you want to have as a, not to say alternative to the CONCACAF Champions Cup, but something to have that grandeur as the continent's premier competition, should not be being outsold by a D3 US soccer match. That just should not happen if you want this thing to have any juice going forward. So having less MLS on MLS matchups will be important, because they're just hard to sell when you play so many MLS games already and you play these teams so often. Like St. Louis and Portland have played each other 5 times already through the first 2 seasons. So that's when you've already hosted a team as often as you have, and you're paired up with other Western Conference teams, unless it's a rivalry game, unless St. Louis were to grab SKC, or whether the LA teams were together, unless it's a big rivalry game. And even then, attendance-wise, for these competitions, they're just not going to be there unless you have the novelty of a top Liga MX club against an MLS club. Even Juarez was not really a big draw for St. Louis as much as it was more than the Portland, but that's also the group stage where there's more time to sell tickets, blah, 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 blah. It's just not working in its current format. And there needs to be a rework there, but also hidden in this as well is that MLS is committed to being in the US Open Cup next year with more teams than were there this year. So if teams are going to be able to pick and choose, it sounds like Garber mentioned he would like some teams to be able to have the opportunity. Yeah, let's just go to the quote. It's important to remember that the league in 2004 and 2005, and then again in 2014 and 2016, looked at a schedule change. So in regards to the potential switch from running from spring to fall, winter, to running from early fall, late summer to spring. So just swapping when things are important, essentially. You're leaving a couple extra weeks here and there. That's logistics to figure out of like, okay, how do we play into late November in the North and the Midwest? And, but it saves those like June, July months that you're playing in Houston that everyone complains about. So there's give and takes. There's good and bad everywhere. Like, I don't think people that aren't from certain places in the U.S. even understand how difficult it is to like control the entire country's schedule when the environments, the atmosphere, the climate is just so different. Okay. We're one of only 2 leagues that still operates on our schedule, but it's complicated. The schedule is more crowded. June has been taken over by most international tournaments. It's forcing us to dig deeper in the past, and it's a lot to work through. We will participate in the USOC again next year, likely with more teams. So that's they're committed to the US Open Cup. More teams. I know for a fact, like St. Louis, if they're not involved, they'll be very, very surprised because that's not my understanding. So I believe that tournament play, if we can have all 30 teams where a team is at least in one tournament, is good for the club. So that makes it sound like some teams will be in more than one, but everyone has to be in either the US Open Cup or the Leagues Cup. It's good for the club. It's good for the fans. We want teams to have the opportunity to lift trophies. If teams can lift multiple trophies, that's a good thing, but it's going to be nearly impossible for all the teams to compete in all the tournaments. There are just not enough games in the schedule. And that's what, essentially it boils down to why Leagues Cup got pitted against the US Open Cup, because, Garber, in his initial comments spoke he spoke down on the US Open Cup and its attendance, but you can't do that when the Leagues Cup this year had very similar attendance issues that US Open Cup has in the early rounds. That's just tournament play in America between when there just isn't that novelty there. And like fans view MLS regular season as more important than these tournament games. That just like is the facts of it. So it's up to the clubs. It's up to the competitions to better market themselves. That goes for both the US Open Cup and the Leagues Cup. There are people that I talked to in St. Louis last year that had no idea what the Leagues Cup are. And these are people that had season tickets for St. Louis City. So it's not even like your diehard fans. It's the diehard of the diehard fans that even really understood what Leagues Cup is. At least older fans that aren't as plugged in, I guess would be how to put that. So that was the interesting takeaways from Don Garber's State of the League address. Of course, now we head into the expansion draft, so we kind of know where things are going. We know what the league's focus is on going forward, whether that means a change in schedule, whether that there's a lot of change coming in. I think there has never been a period of stability for MLS in terms of their schedule or something being flipped and changed. That would be something fun to check in on. Has there ever been one MLS season that has been the exact same in terms of like format, whether that's playoff format, regular season format, teams in the league, conference makeup, division makeup? I think every year there's some sort of change in Major League Soccer. So getting to a point where eventually you have that stability would be nice. But now with San Diego coming in, you're going to have a period of time where the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference have an even number of teams until the next expansions get announced. And that kind of symmetry makes me happy. So no more bye weeks this year. A slight change in the schedule because of that. And everyone will have their expansion protection lists unveiled on Tuesday. So from that point, I'll have some content on Talkin Soccer, just talking about what that expansion draft looks like, talking about like how we can read into how teams have protected players, how teams haven't protected players. But remember, it's not always as simple as Team A doesn't protect player A, so they obviously don't want player A around. It's not that. You only get a certain amount of players you can protect. So, sometimes you are taking a gamble that, San Diego is either going to not have a need at a position, not be interested in the player because of their contract details, because of their international status, injury status, veteran status, what have you. There are tons of reasons why a player might not get picked, and it's essentially GMs playing with their cards close to their vest on, who's going to be available, who's going to want to be available. I learned that at the U.S. men's national team games last month in St. Louis, the GMs all met up to start, to have some conversations about the future of the league, about where things are going, their off-season meetings. And there were some, back and forth with, like if I asked the San Diego GM about, what that might look like, right? Your typical GM nonsense, but there have been some wheelings and dealings. So I would not be surprised if there were some trades announced on draft night that essentially protect certain teams by giving up players and such. So something to look out for. It sounds like there will be some wheeling and dealing. This will not be a straightforward expansion draft, but we shouldn't expect it. I think you can look back at the St. Louis draft. There was a trade on draft night. There were some interesting things with how St. Louis went and grabbed Indiana Vassilev, who was technically out of contract on loan from Aston Villa. There's going to be some interesting shenanigans, chicanery going on that'll be fun to watch. But it will also tell us, in those protection lists, who are the most important players for each club. And I think that'll be important to track as well. So that is where we will end things today. LA Galaxy are your 2024 MLS Cup champions. New York Red Bulls shocked everyone to get here. What will that happen next year? Who knows? And I think it's highly unlikely you see both these teams back in the final next year. But as we found out, injuries happen. Number one seeds get knocked out. Anything can happen in the MLS postseason, and that's why we love it so much. So as always, thank you so much for listening. If you're listening on your podcast player, make sure you give us a like. Make sure you're subscribed. If you're listening on YouTube, make sure you like and subscribe. And comment down below what you thought of the championship game. And if you thought that Paintsel was going to tear someone's arm off for not getting Ricky Puig's jersey over to him quick enough. Let me know down in the comments what you thought. Again, we'll be back later this week. I'm also going to talk some U.S. women's national team, a group of games last weekend that I think we learned a lot from, as well as just the NWSL offseason so far. So thank you all so much for listening, and we will talk very, very soon.